When Dr. Bennett pressed his trembling hands against Bella's impossibly swollen belly, he stumbled backward and declared that in 40 years of practice, he had never seen anything like this. What emerged from that mare 18 hours later would be documented in veterinary journals worldwide as a birth that defied every known law of nature. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The morning sun filtered through the wooden slats of the old barn, casting golden ribbons of light across the hay-covered floor. Dr. Harold Bennett had been a veterinarian for over 40 years in the rural farming community of Willow Creek, and in all those decades he had witnessed thousands of births, treated countless animals, and seen things that would make most people gasp in disbelief. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for what stood before him on that crisp autumn morning. His hand trembled slightly as he reached up to adjust his glasses, his mouth falling open as he took in the sight of the massive chestnut mare before him. Her belly was so enormously swollen that it seemed to defy the very laws of nature, stretching outward in a way that made the experienced veterinarian take an involuntary step backward. Behind him, two young stable hands stood frozen in place, their eyes wide with the same mixture of awe and concern that Dr. Bennett felt coursing through his own veins. The mare, whose name was Bella, belonged to an elderly widow named Margaret Thompson, a woman who had called the veterinarian in a panic just an hour earlier, her voice shaking with worry as she described her beloved horse's condition. Now, standing in the barn that smelled of fresh hay and the earthy warmth of animals, Dr. Bennett understood why Margaret had sounded so terrified on the phone. "I have never seen such a large pregnant mare in my entire career," the veterinarian breathed, his voice barely above a whisper as he slowly approached Bella. The mare turned her head to look at him, her large brown eyes reflecting a mixture of exhaustion and trust. Despite her enormous size, there was a gentleness about her, a patience that spoke of a creature who had endured much and asked for little in return. Dr. Bennett placed his weathered hand on her swollen side and felt movement beneath her skin, strong and persistent, more movement than he had ever felt in a pregnant mare before. Margaret Thompson stood in the doorway of the barn, her silver hair pulled back in a simple bun, her hands clasped together in front of her worn apron. She was 73 years old and had lived on this farm her entire life, first with her parents, then with her husband Samuel, and now alone since Samuel had passed away 3 winters ago. Bella had been a gift from Samuel on their 40th wedding anniversary, a beautiful foal that he had surprised her with on a sunny spring morning. Now, 8 years later, Bella was more than just a horse to Margaret. She was a living connection to her late husband, a daily reminder of his love and the life they had built together on this land. Dr. Bennett turned to face Margaret, his expression a careful mixture of professional concern and personal compassion. He had known Margaret and Samuel for decades, had been the one to care for their animals through all of the seasons of their marriage, and he understood the weight of what he was about to say. "Margaret," he began slowly, choosing his words with the care of a man who had delivered difficult news many times before, "I need to be honest with you. In my 40 years of practice, I have never encountered a pregnancy like this. The size of Bella's abdomen suggests something extraordinary is happening, something that goes beyond a normal foaling." Margaret's hands tightened against each other, her knuckles turning white as she listened to the veterinarian's words. "What do you mean, Harold? Is something wrong with her? Is my Bella going to be all right?" Her voice cracked on the last word, and Dr. Bennett could see the tears beginning to form in the corners of her eyes. He walked over to her and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I believe Bella is carrying multiple foals," he explained gently. It is rare in horses, Margaret, extremely rare. Twin pregnancies occur in only about 1% of all horse pregnancies, and even then, they rarely survive to full term. But what I am feeling in Bella, what I am seeing with my own eyes, suggests that she may be carrying more than twins. The veterinarian paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle in the dusty air of the barn. I need to perform an ultrasound to confirm, but I believe we may be looking at a case that could make veterinary history. The two stable hands, brothers named Thomas and Michael, who had worked on the Thompson farm since they were teenagers, exchanged glances of disbelief. They had helped care for Bella throughout her pregnancy, had noticed how quickly she had grown, how much more food she required, how she moved with increasing difficulty as the months passed. They had assumed it was simply a large foal, perhaps a colt, that would grow to be as magnificent as Bella herself. But the veterinarian's words painted a picture of something far more complex and dangerous. Thomas, the older of the two brothers, stepped forward with a question that had been forming in his mind since Dr. Bennett first arrived. "Doctor, if Bella is carrying multiple foals, what are her chances? What are the foal's chances?" His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed the worry that he felt for the mare he had come to love like his own animal. Dr. Bennett sighed heavily and looked back at Bella, who had lowered her great head to rest it against the wooden railing of her stall. "The honest answer is that I do not know, Thomas. Multiple births in horses are notoriously difficult. The foals often do not develop properly because they are competing for space and nutrition in the womb. Many times, one or more foals are lost before birth, and the delivery itself poses significant risks to the mother." He turned back to face the small group that had gathered in the barn, his expression grave but not without hope. "But I have also learned in my years of practice that animals, like people, are capable of surprising us. Bella is strong, she is healthy, and she has been well cared for. If any mare can beat the odds, it is her." Margaret wiped the tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand and straightened her shoulders with the determination of a woman who had weathered many storms in her long life. "Then we will do whatever it takes to help her," she declared, her voice finding its strength once more. "Samuel gave me Bella, and I made him a promise that I would always take care of her. I intend to keep that promise, no matter what comes." The ultrasound machine hummed quietly in the corner of the barn as Dr. Bennett prepared for the examination that would reveal the truth hidden within Bella's enormous belly. He had sent Thomas into town to retrieve the portable equipment from his clinic. And now, with the late morning sun streaming through the barn windows, the moment of revelation had arrived. Margaret stood close by, her weathered hands gripping the wooden railing so tightly that splinters threatened to embed themselves in her palms. She had not moved from that spot since the veterinarian had begun setting up, her eyes fixed on Bella with an intensity that spoke of prayers whispered in silence. The mare stood remarkably still as Dr. Bennett applied the cool gel to her side, her ears flicking occasionally at the unfamiliar sensation, but otherwise showing no signs of distress. It was as if she understood the importance of what was happening, as if some ancient instinct told her that these humans were trying to help her and the lives she carried within. The veterinarian moved the transducer slowly across her swollen abdomen, his eyes focused on the small screen that would show him what no external examination could reveal. At first, the images were difficult to interpret, shadows and shapes swirling in the grainy display like clouds passing across a stormy sky. Dr. Bennett adjusted the settings, moved the transducer to a different position, and suddenly the picture became clear. His breath caught in his throat, and for a long moment, he simply stared at the screen in absolute silence. Margaret, unable to bear the suspense any longer, took a step forward and asked in a voice that trembled with fear and hope, "Harold, what do you see? Please tell me what is happening inside my Bella." The veterinarian turned to face her, and Margaret saw something in his eyes that she had never seen before in all the years she had known him. It was wonder, pure and unfiltered, the look of a man who had just witnessed something that challenged everything he thought he knew about his profession. "Margaret," he said slowly, his voice thick with emotion, "I count 4 distinct heartbeats. 4 separate foals, all alive, all moving. Your Bella is carrying quadruplets." The word hung in the air like a miracle made manifest, and Margaret felt her knees buckle beneath her. Michael, who had been standing nearby, rushed forward to steady her, guiding her to a hay bale where she could sit down before she collapsed entirely. "4 foals," she whispered, her mind struggling to comprehend what the veterinarian had just told her. "4 babies inside my Bella. How is that even possible?" Dr. Bennett shook his head slowly, still processing the discovery himself. "In all my research, in all my years of practice, I have never heard of a horse successfully carrying quadruplets," he admitted. "There have been cases of triplets, extremely rare cases, but even those almost never survive to birth. What we are witnessing here, Margaret, is something that defies medical probability. It should not be possible, and yet here it is, 4 living foals growing inside your mare." The news spread through the small community of Willow Creek like wildfire carried on the autumn wind. By evening, neighbors who had not spoken to Margaret in months were calling to offer their congratulations and their concerns. The local newspaper sent a reporter to the farm, and within days, the story of Bella the Miracle Mare had reached regional news outlets and veterinary journals across the country. Scientists and horse breeders from distant states began reaching out, requesting permission to observe the pregnancy, to document what could be a once-in-a-lifetime event in equine medicine. But for Margaret, the attention meant little compared to the weight of responsibility she now carried. Every morning, she woke before dawn to check on Bella, to make sure the mare had enough food and water, to simply sit with her in the quiet darkness and whisper words of encouragement. She told Bella stories about Samuel, about the day he had brought her home as a gangly foal, with legs too long for her body, and eyes full of curiosity. She told her about the children they had never been able to have, about the emptiness that had followed them through their marriage until they learned to fill it with love for each other and for the animals that shared their land. "You are giving me something Samuel and I always wanted," Margaret whispered one night as she brushed Bella's golden mane by the light of a single lantern. "A family. 4 little ones to care for, to watch grow, to love." She pressed her forehead against Bella's neck and let the tears fall freely. "I know it is going to be hard, my sweet girl. I know the doctor says the odds are against us. But I believe in you, Bella. I believe you were meant for something extraordinary." Dr. Bennett visited the farm every 3 days to monitor Bella's progress, and each visit brought new amazement. Against all expectations, all 4 foals continued to develop normally. They were smaller than a single foal would be, competing as they were for space and nutrition, but they were growing steadily, and their heartbeats remained strong. The veterinarian began consulting with specialists from universities and equine research centers, sharing data and receiving advice on how to best support Bella through this unprecedented pregnancy. The community of Willow Creek rallied around Margaret in ways she had never expected. Neighbors who had their own farms to tend found time to help with her daily chores, freeing her to focus all her attention on Bella. The local feed store donated extra supplies of the specialized nutrition that Dr. Bennett had prescribed for the pregnant mare. Thomas and Michael, The young stable hands, who had witnessed the ultrasound revelation, became fiercely protective of Bella, taking turns sleeping in the barn to ensure someone was always nearby if she needed help. As the weeks passed and Bella grew even larger, her movements became increasingly labored. She spent most of her time lying in her stall, her massive belly making it difficult to stand for long periods. Margaret had the stable hands bring in extra bedding, creating a soft nest where Bella could rest comfortably. She installed a baby monitor in the barn so she could hear if Bella made any sounds of distress during the night. And she kept her phone charged and ready to call Dr. Bennett at a moment's notice. The veterinarian had warned her that the birth, when it came, would be dangerous. Multiple births in horses were complicated under the best circumstances, and quadruplets presented challenges that no veterinarian had ever faced before. There was a real possibility that not all the foals would survive the delivery. There was a real possibility that Bella herself might not survive. But Margaret refused to let fear consume her. She had lost Samuel, had buried the man she loved after 52 years of marriage, and she had survived. She would survive this too, whatever the outcome, because that was what life demanded of those who chose to keep living. The first snow of winter arrived on a Thursday morning, blanketing the Thompson farm in a pristine layer of white that sparkled under the pale December sun. Margaret stood at her kitchen window, a cup of coffee warming her hands, watching the snowflakes drift lazily from the heavy gray sky. In the barn, Bella was now so large that she could barely turn around in her stall, her belly hanging low and swaying with the weight of the 4 lives she carried. Dr. Bennett had estimated that the birth could happen any day now, and the entire community seemed to be holding its collective breath, waiting for the moment when the miracle would either be completed or shattered. Margaret had not slept well in weeks, her dreams haunted by visions of things going wrong, of losing Bella and the foals, of being left alone on this farm with nothing but memories and grief. But when she was awake, when she sat beside Bella in the warm, hay-scented air of the barn, those fears faded into the background. There was something calming about the mare's presence, something that reminded Margaret that worry could not change the future, only poison the present. Bella seemed to understand this instinctively, the way animals often understand things that humans struggle to accept. That afternoon, a visitor arrived at the farm, someone Margaret had not expected to see. A sleek black car pulled up the snow-covered driveway, its tires crunching against the frozen ground, and from the driver's seat emerged a tall man in an expensive coat, with sharp eyes that scanned the property with obvious appraisal. Margaret recognized him immediately, though they had never met in person. His name was Richard Calloway, and he was one of the wealthiest horse breeders in the state, a man whose racing thoroughbreds had won championships and whose farm was featured in magazines that Margaret had only ever seen in doctor's office waiting rooms. "Mrs. Thompson," Calloway said as he approached, his voice smooth and confident, extending a gloved hand in greeting. "I apologize for arriving unannounced, but I felt this matter was best discussed in person. I have been following the news about your remarkable mare, and I have come with a proposition that I believe will interest you greatly." Margaret shook his hand cautiously, her instincts telling her that this man had not driven all the way to Willow Creek simply to offer his congratulations. She led him into the farmhouse, where the fire crackled in the hearth, and the smell of fresh bread filled the air. Calloway looked around at the modest furnishings, the worn rugs, the photographs on the mantel showing decades of life on this land, and Margaret could see the calculation in his eyes. He was assessing not just her home, but her circumstances, trying to determine how much leverage he might have in whatever negotiation he was about to propose. "Mrs. Thompson," Calloway began once they were seated, his coffee untouched on the table before him, What is happening in your barn is nothing short of extraordinary. Quadruplet foals have never been successfully born to any mare in recorded history. The scientific value alone is immeasurable, to say nothing of the financial implications. He leaned forward, his eyes locked on hers with an intensity that made Margaret uncomfortable. I am prepared to offer you $500,000 for Bella and whatever foals survive the birth. The number hung in the air between them, enormous and tempting. $500,000 was more money than Margaret had ever seen in her life, more than the farm itself was worth, enough to ensure that she would never have to worry about bills or repairs or the cost of heating oil through the long winter months. She thought about the leaking roof that needed replacing, the tractor that barely started anymore, the mounting veterinary bills that Dr. Bennett had been too kind to press her about. $500,000 would solve every problem she had. But then she thought about Samuel, about the morning he had led a young Bella into this very barn, with a red ribbon around her neck and a smile on his face that she could still see when she closed her eyes. She thought about the promise she had made to care for Bella always, to give her the life she deserved, to honor the love that Samuel had expressed through his gift. And she thought about Bella herself, lying in the barn right now, trusting Margaret completely, trusting that the woman who had cared for her every day for 8 years would never betray her. "Mr. Calloway," Margaret said quietly, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands, "I appreciate you coming all this way, and I understand that your offer is generous by any reasonable measure. But Bella is not for sale. She never has been, and she never will be. She is family, and where I come from, family is not something you put a price tag on." Calloway's expression shifted, the smooth charm giving way to something harder and more calculating. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, his tone taking on an edge that had not been there before, "I do not think you fully understand the situation. Those foals, if they survive, will be worth millions to the right buyers. Racing syndicates, breeding programs, research institutions, they will all be clamoring to acquire them. You are a widow, living alone on a struggling farm. Can you really afford to turn down this kind of opportunity?" Margaret rose from her chair and walked to the window, looking out at the barn where Bella waited. She could feel Calloway's eyes on her back, could sense his frustration and his certainty that she would eventually see reason, that money would win out over sentiment as it always did. But he did not know her, did not understand the steel that 52 years of farming life had forged in her spine. "My husband and I built this farm from nothing," she said without turning around. "We worked every day from sunup to sundown, through droughts and floods, and markets that tried to break us. We lost babies that never got to be born, dreams that never got to come true. But we never gave up on each other, and we never gave up on the animals that depended on us." She turned to face Calloway, her eyes blazing with a quiet fire. "Bella is going to give birth on this farm, surrounded by people who love her. Her foals are going to grow up here, running in the same fields where their mother learned to run, and no amount of money is going to change that." Calloway stood, his jaw tight with barely contained anger. "You are making a mistake, Mrs. Thompson, a very expensive mistake." He pulled a business card from his pocket and placed it on the table. "When reality sets in, when the bills pile up and you realize you cannot afford to care for 5 horses on your own, you will call me, and my offer will be considerably less generous." He left without another word, the door closing behind him with a finality that echoed through the quiet farmhouse. Margaret watched his car disappear down the driveway, then sank into her chair and let out a long, shaky breath. She had made her choice, had turned down more money than she could comprehend, and she did not regret it for a single moment. The days following Richard Calloway's visit were filled with an uneasy tension that seemed to settle over the Thompson farm like a second layer of snow. Margaret tried to put the wealthy breeder's words out of her mind, tried to focus on Bella and the impending birth, but his warning echoed in her thoughts during the quiet hours of the night when sleep refused to come. When reality sets in, he had said, when the bills pile up. She knew he was not entirely wrong about the practical challenges she faced. Caring for one horse was expensive enough. Caring for 5 would require resources she simply did not have. But Margaret had survived difficult times before, had found ways to make ends meet when the odds seemed impossible, and she refused to let fear drive her decisions now. She sat down at her kitchen table one evening with a notebook and a pencil worn down to a stub, and she began to make a list of everything she would need once the foals arrived. Formula, because there was no way Bella could produce enough milk for 4 hungry babies. Heating lamps, because newborn foals needed warmth, and the barn's old walls let in too much cold. Veterinary supplies, medications, extra bedding, and 100 other things that added up to numbers that made her head spin. She was still staring at that list when Thomas knocked on her door, his face red from the cold, and his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, stamping snow from his boots, "my brother and I have been talking, and we want you to know that we are not going anywhere. Whatever happens with Bella, whatever you need, we are here to help. We do not expect extra pay or anything like that. This is personal for us now. Bella is special, and so are you." Margaret felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, and she pulled the young man into a hug that surprised them both. "Thank you, Thomas," she whispered. "You and Michael have been a blessing to this farm. I do not know how I would have managed without you these past months." Word of Calloway's offer had spread through Willow Creek, as word of everything eventually spread through small communities where everyone knew everyone else's business. The reaction was swift and unanimous. People were outraged that an outsider had tried to swoop in and buy something that belonged to one of their own, to reduce a miracle to a simple financial transaction. The anger galvanized the community in ways that Margaret had never expected. The owner of the hardware store arrived one morning with a truckload of lumber and insisted on repairing the barn's drafty walls at no charge. The women from the church organized a fundraiser, selling baked goods and handmade crafts, and presented Margaret with an envelope containing nearly $3,000 for veterinary expenses. Local farmers donated hay and feed, far more than Margaret could have afforded on her own. Even the children from the elementary school got involved, making cards and drawings for Bella that Margaret taped to the walls of the barn where the MARE could see them. Dr. Bennett, who had been treating the animals of Willow Creek since before many of its current residents were born, announced that he would waive his fees for Bella's delivery and the foal's initial care. When Margaret tried to protest, he held up his hand and silenced her with a gentle smile. "Margaret," he said, "I became a veterinarian because I love animals and I wanted to help them. What is happening in your barn is the most remarkable thing I have ever witnessed in my career. Being part of it is payment enough." The outpouring of support overwhelmed Margaret, filling her heart with a warmth that countered the bitter cold of winter. She had always considered herself a private person, someone who preferred to handle her problems on her own rather than burden others with her troubles. But now she understood that accepting help was not a weakness. It was an acknowledgement of the connections that bound people together, the invisible threads of community that made life meaningful. As Christmas approached, the farm took on an atmosphere of hopeful anticipation. Thomas and Michael decorated the barn with strings of lights that cast a cheerful glow over Bella's stall. Margaret placed a small Christmas tree in the corner, hung with ornaments that Samuel had carved from wood during the long winter evenings of their marriage. She told Bella about each ornament, about the memories attached to them, about the life she and Samuel had shared on this land. On Christmas Eve, Margaret sat alone in the barn while snow fell silently outside, the world wrapped in a blanket of white peace. Bella lay on her side, her breathing slow and heavy, her belly rising and falling with the rhythm of 4 tiny hearts beating in unison. Margaret stroked the mare's neck and began to sing softly, the old carols that her mother had taught her as a child, songs of hope and miracles, and the promise of new life in the darkest time of year. "Samuel," she whispered, when the singing faded into silence, "I wish you could see this. I wish you could be here to meet these babies when they come. But I know you are watching somehow. I feel you in this barn, in every breath Bella takes, in every kindness our neighbors have shown." She pressed her hand against Bella's warm side and felt the folds moving within. "We are going to be all right, my love. All of us. I promise." The new year arrived with bitter winds and temperatures that plunged below zero, but inside the barn, warmth prevailed. Dr. Bennett had installed additional heating and monitoring equipment, transforming the rustic space into something resembling a proper equine birthing suite. He visited daily now, checking Bella's vital signs, measuring her belly, watching for any indication that labor was imminent. It could happen any time, he told Margaret one afternoon as they stood together watching Bella rest. "Her body is ready. The foals are in position. Now we simply have to wait and trust that nature knows what it is doing." He paused, his weathered face showing the concern he could not quite hide. "But I want you to be prepared, Margaret. This birth is going to be unlike anything any of us have experienced. We will do everything in our power to save Bella and all 4 foals, but I cannot make any guarantees. Multiple births in horses are inherently dangerous." Margaret nodded, her jaw set with determination. "I understand, Harold. I have been preparing myself for every possible outcome, but I have also been praying for a miracle, and I believe that sometimes prayers are answered." The call came at 3 in the morning on a Friday in late January, the shrill ring of the telephone cutting through the silent darkness of Margaret's bedroom like a knife. She was awake before the second ring, her heart already pounding with the knowledge of what this call must mean. Thomas's voice on the other end was breathless and urgent. "Mrs. Thompson, you need to come to the barn right now. It is time. Bella is in labor." Margaret threw on her clothes without thought, her fingers fumbling with buttons and zippers, her mind racing with 1,000 fears and hopes that tangled together like threads in a knot she could not untie. She grabbed her coat from the hook by the door and stepped out into a night so cold that her breath crystallized instantly in the air. The walk to the barn had never seemed so long, each step through the crusted snow feeling like a mile, the yellow glow of the barn lights ahead drawing her forward like a beacon. Inside, the scene was one of controlled chaos. Dr. Bennett had arrived minutes before Margaret, his medical bag open on a hay bale, his instruments laid out in precise rows that gleamed under the overhead lights. Thomas and Michael moved with quiet efficiency, following the veterinarian's instructions without question, their faces pale but determined. And in the center of it all lay Bella, her massive body trembling with the effort of bringing new life into the world, her eyes wide with a mixture of pain and primal instinct. Margaret rushed to Bella's side and knelt in the hay, taking the mare's great head in her lap and stroking her face with hands that shook despite her efforts to steady them. "I am here, sweet girl," she murmured, her voice cracking with emotion. "I am right here with you, and I am not going anywhere. You can do this, Bella. You are the strongest, bravest horse I have ever known, and you can do this." Dr. Bennett moved to examine Bella, his experienced hands gentle but thorough, as he assessed the progress of the labor. "The first foal is coming," he announced, his voice calm and professional, despite the extraordinary circumstances. "It appears to be positioned correctly. Margaret, I need you to keep Bella calm. Talk to her, sing to her, whatever it takes to keep her from panicking. The next few hours are going to be the most difficult of her life." The barn fell into a rhythm of waiting and watching, of tension that ebbed and flowed like waves against a shore. Bella labored through the dark hours of the morning, her body working instinctively to bring forth the lives she had nurtured for so many months. Margaret never left her side, her voice growing hoarse from the constant stream of encouragement and love that she poured into the mare's ears. She told Bella about Samuel again, about how proud he would be, about how the whole town was praying for her and her babies. At 5:17 in the morning, as the first pale light of dawn began to seep through the barn windows, the first foal entered the world. It was a filly, tiny and perfect, her coat a deep chestnut that matched her mother's almost exactly. Dr. Bennett caught her as she emerged and quickly cleared her airways, and the barn filled with the most beautiful sound Margaret had ever heard. The high, trembling whinny of a newborn horse taking her first breath. There was no time to celebrate, no time to process the miracle that had just occurred, because Bella's labor continued without pause. The second foal came 20 minutes later, another filly, this one with a white star on her forehead that seemed to glow in the lamplight. Then a colt, smaller than his sisters, but fighting with a determination that made Dr. Bennett smile through his exhaustion. And finally, nearly 2 hours after the first, the fourth foal arrived, a colt with legs that seemed too long for his body, and eyes that opened almost immediately, looking around the barn as if trying to understand the strange new world he had entered. 4 foals, 4 living, breathing, impossible miracles lying in the hay beside their mother, their small bodies steaming in the cold air as they struggled to find their legs. Margaret could not speak, could not do anything but kneel there with tears streaming down her face, watching as Bella lifted her head to examine her babies. The mare's exhaustion was evident in every line of her body, but there was something else there, too. Pride. Love. The ancient instinct of motherhood that transcended species and circumstance. Dr. Bennett sat back on his heels and let out a long breath that seemed to carry the weight of hours of tension with it. "I do not believe it," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. "I have just witnessed something that should not be possible. 4 healthy foals, all alive, all breathing." He looked at Margaret with eyes that glistened in the lamplight. "Margaret, do you understand what has happened here tonight? This has never been documented before in equine history. Never." The news spread through Willow Creek before the sun had fully risen, passed from neighbor to neighbor in excited phone calls and shouted conversations across snow-covered yards. By mid-morning, a small crowd had gathered outside the Thompson barn, kept at a respectful distance by Thomas and Michael, but unwilling to leave without catching a glimpse of the miracle foals. Margaret, exhausted beyond measure, but running on pure adrenaline, emerged periodically to give updates, to thank the well-wishers, to share in the joy that seemed to fill the very air. Inside the barn, Bella rested while her foals nursed in turns, their tiny mouths seeking the nourishment that would help them grow strong. Dr. Bennett had warned Margaret that the next few days would be critical, that premature and multiple birth foals faced countless challenges that could prove fatal. But as she watched the 4 babies huddle against their mother's warmth, their small bodies rising and falling with each breath, Margaret felt a peace settle over her heart, did it, Samuel," she whispered to the empty air, knowing somehow that he was listening. "Our Bella did it. She gave us a family, and now it is up to me to make sure they all survive, to give them the life they deserve." She reached out and touched each foal in turn, feeling the soft warmth of their newborn coats, the flutter of their heartbeats beneath her fingertips. "I promise you, little ones, I will protect you with everything I have." The first week after the birth was a blur of sleepless nights and constant vigilance that tested Margaret's strength in ways she had never imagined. The 4 foals, whom she had named Hope, Grace, Samuel Jr., and Faith, required feeding every 2 hours around the clock. Bella produced milk, but not nearly enough to sustain 4 growing babies, and Margaret found herself mixing formula in the farmhouse kitchen at all hours, carrying bottles out to the barn through snow that sometimes reached her knees. Dr. Bennett visited twice daily, monitoring the foal's weight and development with meticulous attention. The smallest of the 4, Samuel Jr., worried him the most. The little colt was not gaining weight as quickly as his siblings, and there were moments when his breathing seemed labored, his tiny chest heaving with effort. Margaret refused to leave his side during those frightening hours, holding him in her lap and feeding him drops of formula from an eyedropper when he was too weak to nurse from the bottle. "You cannot save them all through sheer willpower, Margaret," Dr. Bennett told her gently one evening as she rocked Samuel Jr. against her chest. "Sometimes nature makes choices that we cannot understand or accept. I need you to prepare yourself for the possibility that this little one might not make it." Margaret looked up at the veterinarian with eyes that burned with fierce determination. "Samuel gave me Bella," she said quietly, "and Bella gave me these foals. Every single one of them carries a piece of my husband's memory, a piece of the love we shared. I will not give up on any of them, not while there is still breath in my body and fight in my heart." Her stubbornness proved stronger than the veterinarian's pessimism. By the end of the 2nd week, Samuel Jr. had turned a corner. He began nursing with more vigor, gaining weight steadily, his weak legs growing stronger with each passing day. Dr. Bennett shook his head in amazement during one of his visits, watching the colt wobble around the stall on legs that had barely supported him just days before. "I have been a veterinarian for over 4 decades, and I have learned one thing above all else. Never underestimate the power of love. What you have done for these foals, Margaret, it defies medical explanation." As word of the miracle birth continued to spread, the Thompson farm became something of a pilgrimage site for horse lovers and curiosity seekers from across the region. Margaret established visiting hours, allowing small groups to observe the foals from a safe distance, while Thomas and Michael stood guard to ensure that no one disturbed Bella or her babies. The visitors came bearing gifts, blankets and toys, and bags of the special feed that the growing foals required, their generosity adding to the mountain of support that the community had already provided. But not all the attention was welcome. Richard Calloway had not forgotten about Bella and her extraordinary offspring. 3 weeks after the birth, Margaret received a letter delivered by certified mail, the expensive paper and formal letterhead making her stomach clench with dread before she even read the first word. The letter was from Calloway's lawyers, claiming that the wealthy breeder had evidence suggesting Bella had been bred with one of his stallions without proper authorization. He was asserting ownership rights over the foals and demanding that Margaret surrender them immediately or face legal action. The letter trembled in Margaret's hands as she read it a second time, then a third, trying to make sense of the accusations. It was absurd, completely fabricated. Bella had been bred with a stallion from a neighboring farm, a transaction documented with proper paperwork and witnessed by multiple people. Calloway's claim was nothing but a desperate attempt to take what he could not buy, to use his wealth and legal resources to bully a widow into submission. Margaret did not cry. She did not panic. Instead, she picked up the telephone and called the one person she knew could help her fight back. Eleanor Walsh was a lawyer who had grown up in Willow Creek before moving to the city to build a successful practice. She and Margaret had been friends since childhood, had played together in these very fields, had stood beside each other at weddings and funerals and all the moments that marked a life. When Margaret explained the situation, Eleanor's response was immediate and fierce. "That man has no case," Eleanor declared, her voice crackling with righteous anger over the phone line. "He is counting on you being too poor and too overwhelmed to fight back. But he does not know what he is dealing with. I will take this case pro bono, Margaret. Calloway is going to learn that money cannot buy everything, especially not justice." The legal battle that followed consumed the next several months, unfolding in courtrooms and conference rooms far from the peaceful fields of the Thompson farm. Calloway's lawyers were aggressive and well-funded, filing motion after motion designed to drain Margaret's resources and break her will. But Eleanor matched them move for move, her brilliant legal mind cutting through their arguments like a blade through silk. She gathered witnesses, compiled documentation, built a case so airtight that even Calloway's expensive legal team could not find a crack to exploit. Meanwhile, on the farm, the foals continued to grow and thrive, oblivious to the human drama swirling around them. They took their first tentative steps outside the barn on a mild day in early March, their long legs tangling comically as they discovered grass and sunlight, and the vast open space of the world beyond their stall. Margaret watched them play, their small bodies full of energy and joy, and felt her resolve strengthen with every passing moment. These were her babies, her family, and no amount of money or legal threats would take them from her. The community rallied once again, this time in defense of Margaret's right to keep what was rightfully hers. Farmers who had known Calloway's reputation for ruthless business practices came forward with stories of their own, painting a picture of a man who believed that wealth entitled him to take whatever he wanted. The local newspaper ran a series of articles examining Calloway's business dealings, uncovering patterns of intimidation and exploitation that shocked even those who thought they knew him. The tide was turning, and everyone could feel it. Richard Calloway had made a grave miscalculation when he decided to target Margaret Thompson and her miracle foals. He had expected an easy victory, a quick surrender from a vulnerable widow. Instead, he had awakened a community, united a town, and created an enemy far more powerful than any individual. The battle was not yet won, but for the first time since the letter arrived, Margaret allowed herself to hope. The courtroom was nothing like Margaret had imagined. She had expected something grand and imposing, with high ceilings and stern-faced judges who spoke in incomprehensible legal terminology. Instead, she found herself in a modest chamber with fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead and wooden benches worn smooth by decades of anxious waiting. But the modesty of the surroundings did nothing to diminish the weight of what was at stake. Everything she had worked for, everything she had fought to protect, would be decided within these walls. Eleanor sat beside her at the defendant's table, a stack of folders arranged in precise order, her expression calm and confident despite the gravity of the moment. Across the aisle, Richard Calloway sat with his team of lawyers, men in expensive suits who whispered among themselves and occasionally glanced toward Margaret with expressions of thinly veiled contempt. Calloway himself stared straight ahead, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on some point in the distance, as if the proceedings were beneath his attention. The judge, A silver-haired woman named Patricia Morrison entered the courtroom and took her seat with an air of quiet authority that commanded immediate silence. She had a reputation for fairness and an intolerance for theatrics, and as she reviewed the documents before her, Margaret felt a flicker of hope that justice might actually prevail in this room. The hearing proceeded with a formality that felt almost surreal to Margaret, who had spent her entire life in the practical world of farming, where disputes were settled with handshakes and honest conversation. Lawyers spoke in measured tones, presenting evidence and making arguments that seemed designed more to impress than to illuminate. But Eleanor cut through the complexity with a directness that Margaret found deeply reassuring. "Your Honor," Eleanor began when it was her turn to speak, "this case is not complicated despite my opponent's attempts to make it so. Mrs. Thompson's mare was bred with a stallion named Copper King, owned by the Patterson family of neighboring Harrison County. I have here the breeding contract, signed by both parties, along with veterinary records documenting the artificial insemination procedure." She held up the documents for the judge to see. Mr. Calloway's claim that Bella was somehow bred with one of his stallions is not only unsupported by evidence, but is contradicted by every piece of documentation in existence. Calloway's lead attorney, a sharp-faced man named Henderson, rose to respond. His voice was smooth and practiced, the voice of someone who had spent years convincing judges and juries to see things his way. "Your Honor, we are not disputing that Mrs. Thompson may have contracted for a breeding with the Patterson stallion. What we are suggesting is that an unauthorized breeding occurred as well, possibly without Mrs. Thompson's knowledge. The genetic markers of the foals will prove that at least one of them carries bloodlines from Mr. Calloway's championship stallion, Thunder's legacy." Margaret's heart clenched at the accusation. She looked at Eleanor, who gave her a reassuring nod before rising once again. "Your Honor, we anticipated this argument and have prepared accordingly." She gestured toward the back of the courtroom, where Dr. Bennett sat waiting. "I would like to call Dr. Harold Bennett to the stand. He is a licensed veterinarian with over 40 years of experience and has been caring for Bella throughout her pregnancy and the subsequent birth of her foals." Dr. Bennett took the stand with the quiet dignity of a man who had nothing to prove and nothing to hide. He described in detail the ultrasounds he had performed, the genetic testing he had ordered, and the meticulous records he had maintained throughout Bella's unprecedented pregnancy. When Eleanor asked him directly whether there was any evidence suggesting that the foals could have been sired by any stallion other than Copper King, his answer was unequivocal. "Absolutely not," Dr. Bennett stated firmly, his eyes meeting those of Judge Morrison. "I have conducted comprehensive genetic testing on all 4 foals, and the results conclusively match Copper King as the sire. There is no genetic evidence whatsoever linking these foals to Thunder's legacy or any other stallion. Mr. Calloway's claims are not only unfounded, but are scientifically impossible based on the evidence." The courtroom fell silent as the weight of Dr. Bennett's testimony settled over the proceedings. Margaret watched Calloway's face and saw something she had not seen before. Doubt, fear, the realization that his expensive lawyers and fabricated claims might not be enough to win him what he wanted. For a man accustomed to getting his way through sheer force of wealth, this was unfamiliar territory. Henderson attempted to challenge Dr. Bennett's testimony, questioning his credentials, suggesting that his long friendship with Margaret might have compromised his objectivity. But the veterinarian deflected every attack with the calm assurance of someone speaking the truth. And by the time he stepped down from the stand, it was clear that Calloway's case was crumbling. Judge Morrison called a brief recess, during which Margaret sat in stunned silence, hardly daring to believe that things might actually go her way. Eleanor squeezed her hand and whispered words of encouragement. but Margaret could barely hear them over the pounding of her own heart. She thought about Bella and the foals waiting for her back at the farm, about Samuel and the life they had built together, about all the people who had supported her through this nightmare. When court reconvened, Judge Morrison wasted no time in delivering her ruling. Her voice was clear and firm, each word landing with the weight of legal authority. After reviewing all evidence presented by both parties and hearing testimony from qualified experts, this court finds no merit in Mr. Calloway's claims of ownership over the foals born to the mare known as Bella. The genetic evidence conclusively establishes that the foals were sired by Copper King, as documented in the breeding contract between Mrs. Thompson and the Patterson family. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face, but she made no move to wipe them away. She listened as the judge continued, her words growing sharper as she addressed Calloway directly. Furthermore, this court is troubled by the nature of this lawsuit, which appears to be a calculated attempt to use the legal system to harass and intimidate a private citizen. Mr. Calloway, you have wasted this court's time and resources with claims you knew or should have known were without foundation. I am referring this matter to the State Bar for investigation of potential misconduct by your legal team. The gavel came down with a sound like thunder, and Margaret Thompson's nightmare was finally over. The drive home from the courthouse felt different than any journey Margaret had ever taken. The familiar roads of Willow Creek seemed transformed somehow, brighter and more beautiful than she remembered, as if the weight that had been lifted from her shoulders had also lifted a veil from her eyes. Eleanor drove while Margaret sat in the passenger seat, still processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. She had won. Against all odds, against wealth and power and legal intimidation, she had won. When they turned onto the long driveway leading to the Thompson farm, Margaret gasped at the sight that greeted her. The yard was filled with people, dozens of friends and neighbors who had gathered to await the verdict. Thomas stood at the front of the crowd, his phone still in his hand from the call Eleanor had made immediately after the ruling. The moment Margaret stepped out of the car, the air erupted with cheers and applause that echoed across the snow-covered fields. "She won!" Thomas shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "Margaret won, and those foals are staying right where they belong." The crowd surged forward, surrounding Margaret with hugs and handshakes and tears of joy. These were the people who had stood by her through everything, who had donated their time and money and labor to help her care for Bella and the foals, who had refused to let a wealthy bully destroy one of their own. Margaret made her way through the well-wishers toward the barn, desperate to see Bella and the babies who had been at the center of this entire ordeal. When she pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside, the familiar scent of hay and horses wrapped around her like a warm embrace. Bella stood in her stall, her 4 foals gathered around her, all of them turning to look at Margaret, as if they had been waiting for her return. "We did it," Margaret whispered, walking slowly toward the stall, her eyes blurring with tears. "Nobody is ever going to take you away from me. You are safe now, all of you, forever." She reached out and touched each foal in turn, Hope and Grace and Samuel Jr. and Faith, feeling their soft coats beneath her fingers, marveling at how much they had grown in the months since their miraculous birth. Bella lowered her great head and pressed her muzzle against Margaret's chest, a gesture of affection that the mare had developed over their years together. Margaret wrapped her arms around Bella's neck and held on tight, letting the tears flow freely, releasing all the fear and anxiety and exhaustion that she had been carrying for so long. In that moment, surrounded by the animals she loved in the barn her husband had built, Margaret felt a peace deeper than anything she had ever known. The community celebration that followed was unlike anything Willow Creek had seen in decades. Tables were set up in Margaret's yard, laden with food that neighbors had prepared, while children ran and played in the snow, and adults gathered in groups to share stories and laughter. Someone had brought a portable speaker, and old country songs filled the air, mixing with the sounds of celebration to create a symphony of joy. Dr. Bennett arrived as the sun was setting, his face creased with the biggest smile Margaret had ever seen on the normally reserved veterinarian. "I just got off the phone with a colleague at the State Veterinary Association," he told her, his voice trembling with excitement. "Margaret, the story of Bella and her foals has spread far beyond Willow Creek. Researchers from universities across the country are requesting permission to study them. This birth is going to change our understanding of equine reproduction. You and Bella have made history." Margaret listened to his words, but her attention kept drifting toward the barn, where the foals were resting with their mother. History was all well and good, but what mattered most to her was much simpler than scientific advancement or medical breakthroughs. What mattered was that her family was safe, together, and would remain that way for as long as she drew breath. As the evening wore on and the celebration gradually wound down, Margaret found herself standing alone at the fence that bordered the south pasture. The stars were beginning to emerge in the darkening sky, pinpricks of light that seemed to pulse with life against the vast blackness of space. She thought about Samuel, about how much he would have loved this day, how proud he would have been to see the community rally around his wife and the mare he had given her so many years ago. "I wish you were here," she said softly to the empty air. "I wish you could see what Bella has done, what we have all accomplished together. But I know you are watching somehow. I feel you in the wind, in the stars, in the gentle breathing of those foals as they sleep." Her voice caught, and she paused to steady herself. "Thank you for giving me Bella, Samuel. Thank you for believing in me, for loving me, for building this life with me. I will honor your memory every single day, in everything I do." A sound behind her made Margaret turn, and she found Thomas approaching with 2 mugs of hot cocoa in his hands. "Thought you might be getting cold out here," he said, offering her one of the mugs. "It has been quite a day." Margaret accepted the cocoa gratefully, wrapping her cold fingers around the warm ceramic. "It has been quite a year," she corrected with a small laugh. "I still cannot quite believe it is all real. The foals, the lawsuit, winning in court. It feels like a dream that I am afraid I will wake up from." Thomas stood beside her, looking out at the same stars that had captivated her attention. "It is real, Mrs. Thompson. All of it. And you know what else is real? The way this community came together for you. The way people who had their own problems and their own struggles dropped everything to help." He turned to look at her, his young face serious in the starlight. "You showed us something important these past months. You showed us that doing the right thing matters, even when it is hard, even when powerful people try to stop you." Margaret smiled and placed her hand on the young man's shoulder. "We showed each other, Thomas. None of this would have been possible without people like you and your brother, without Dr. Bennett and Eleanor and everyone who refused to let Callaway win. That is what community means. That is what love means. We carry each other through the impossible." Spring arrived in Willow Creek with a gentleness that seemed to mirror the peace that had settled over the Thompson farm. The snow melted gradually, revealing patches of green grass that grew brighter each day, and the air filled with the songs of returning birds who had spent the winter in warmer climates. Margaret stood at the pasture fence one morning, watching as Hope, Grace, Samuel Jr., and Faith ran through the fields with the boundless energy of youth, their legs no longer wobbly but strong and sure. The foals had grown remarkably in the months since their birth, each developing a distinct personality that delighted everyone who encountered them. Hope, the firstborn, was bold and curious, always the first to investigate anything new that appeared in the pasture. Grace lived up to her name, moving with an elegance that seemed impossible for such a young horse, her white star gleaming like a beacon on her forehead. Samuel Jr. had overcome his difficult start to become the most affectionate of the four, constantly seeking human contact and nuzzling anyone who came within reach. And Faith, the last-born, was the dreamer of the group, often standing apart from her siblings to gaze at the horizon as if contemplating mysteries that only she could perceive. Bella watched over her children with the calm assurance of a mother who had accomplished something extraordinary and knew it. She had recovered fully from the difficult birth, her coat glossy and her eyes bright with contentment. Margaret often found herself simply standing and watching the little family, marveling at the chain of events that had brought them all to this moment. A gift from a loving husband, a pregnancy that defied all odds, a birth that made history, and a battle that tested the strength of an entire community. The attention from the outside world had not diminished since the court victory. If anything, it had intensified. Documentary filmmakers had approached Margaret about telling her story, and veterinary journals continued to publish articles about the unprecedented quadruplet birth. Researchers visited regularly, collecting data and observing the foal's development, always treating both the animals and their owner with the utmost respect. Margaret had initially been uncomfortable with all the attention, but she had come to see it as an opportunity to share a message that she believed was important. "These foals are not just a scientific curiosity," she told a reporter who had traveled from the city to interview her. "They are proof that miracles still happen, that love and determination can overcome obstacles that seem impossible." Everyone who meets them leaves with a little more hope in their hearts, and that is worth more than all the fame or recognition in the world. The interview was published in a national magazine, accompanied by photographs of Margaret with Bella, and the foals that captured the bond between them in a way that words alone could not express. Letters began arriving at the farm from people across the country, strangers who had read the story and felt moved to share their own experiences. Some wrote about animals they had loved and lost, others about challenges they had faced and overcome. Each letter was a reminder that the Thompson farm story had touched something universal, a longing for connection and hope that transcended geography and circumstance. Richard Calloway had disappeared from public view following his defeat in court. The state bar investigation had resulted in sanctions against his legal team, and rumors circulated that his business empire was facing difficulties unrelated to the lawsuit. Margaret took no pleasure in his troubles. She had never wanted to destroy him, only to protect what was rightfully hers. When someone mentioned his name during a conversation at the general store, she simply shook her head and changed the subject. Holding on to anger was like carrying a heavy stone, she had learned, and she had carried enough burdens in her life. As the foals approached their first birthday, plans began to take shape for a celebration that would bring the community together once again. The anniversary of the historic birth had taken on almost sacred significance in Willow Creek, a symbol of everything the town valued and everything they had fought to protect. Committees formed to organize food and entertainment, and the local school children prepared a special presentation about the foals that they would perform at the gathering. Margaret threw herself into the preparations with an energy that surprised even herself. She had always been a private person, more comfortable with animals than with crowds, But something had shifted within her during the past year. She had learned to accept help, to embrace community, to understand that sharing joy multiplied it in ways that keeping it to oneself never could. The night before the celebration, Margaret walked to the barn one last time to check on Bella and the foals before bed. The air was warm and fragrant with the scent of blooming flowers, and fireflies danced in the darkness like tiny stars that had fallen to earth. Inside the barn, the family of horses dozed peacefully. The foals clustered around their mother in a tableau of perfect contentment. Margaret leaned against the stall door and let her mind wander back through the year, remembering all the moments of fear and joy, struggle and triumph. She thought about Dr. Bennett's face when he first saw the ultrasound images, about the community members who had donated their time and resources without being asked, about Eleanor's fierce determination in the courtroom, about Thomas and Michael sleeping in the barn during the coldest nights to ensure that the foals stayed warm. "Tomorrow is going to be a beautiful day," she whispered to Bella, who opened one eye to look at her with an expression that seemed almost to smile. "Everyone is coming to celebrate you and your babies. You have no idea how many lives you have touched, how much hope you have given to people who needed it." She reached out and stroked the mare's neck gently. "But I think maybe you do know. I think you have always known that you were special, that you were meant for something extraordinary." Bella closed her eye again and let out a soft breath that sounded almost like a sigh of agreement. Margaret smiled and turned to leave, pausing at the barn door to look back one more time at the family that had changed her life in ways she was still discovering. "Sleep well, my loves," she said softly. "Tomorrow we celebrate everything you are and everything you mean to this world." The morning of the celebration dawned with the sky so blue and cloudless that it seemed painted by an artist who wanted to create the perfect backdrop for a perfect day. Margaret woke early, as she always did, but instead of her usual quiet routine, she found herself filled with an anticipation that made her heart race like a young girl on Christmas morning. She dressed in her nicest clothes, a simple blue dress that Samuel had always loved, and pinned a small flower to her collar before heading outside to greet the day. The farm was already buzzing with activity when she stepped onto the porch. Volunteers had arrived at dawn to set up tables and chairs, to hang decorations from the fence posts and barn rafters, to transform the humble Thompson property into a venue worthy of the occasion. The smell of cooking food drifted from multiple directions as neighbors prepared their contributions to the potluck feast. Children ran through the yard, their laughter mixing with the sounds of hammering and conversation to create a symphony of community spirit. Thomas appeared at Margaret's side with a cup of coffee and a smile that stretched from ear to ear. "Happy anniversary, Mrs. Thompson," he said, gesturing toward the growing crowd. "Looks like the whole county turned out for this one." Margaret accepted the coffee and looked around at the sea of familiar faces, feeling a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the beverage. By noon, the celebration was in full swing. Hundreds of people filled the yard and spilled out into the surrounding fields, more than Margaret had ever seen gathered in one place outside of the county fair. They had come from Willow Creek and beyond, from neighboring towns and distant cities, drawn by the story that had captured imaginations across the country. Television crews set up cameras at respectful distances, documenting the event for audiences who could not attend in person. The highlight of the celebration came in the early afternoon, when Margaret led Bella and the 4 yearling foals out of the barn and into the pasture where everyone could see them. A hush fell over the crowd as the family of horses emerged into the sunlight, their coats gleaming, their movements confident and proud. Hope led the way, followed by Grace and Samuel Jr. and Faith, with Bella bringing up the rear like a queen, surveying her kingdom. Margaret stood at the fence and watched as visitors approached to admire the foals, keeping a respectful distance, but unable to hide their wonder at what they were witnessing. She heard fragments of conversation, exclamations of amazement, whispered prayers of gratitude from people whose lives had been touched by this story of perseverance and love. A young girl in a wheelchair was lifted by her father, so she could see over the heads of the adults, and her face lit up with a joy so pure that Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. Dr. Bennett made his way through the crowd to stand beside Margaret, his weathered face showing the emotion he usually kept so carefully controlled. "I have been thinking about this past year," he said quietly, watching the foals play in the grass, "about everything that has happened since you brought Bella to my clinic with that impossible belly." He shook his head slowly, as if still struggling to believe his own memories. "In all my years of practice, I never expected to witness anything like this. But you know what strikes me most, Margaret? It is not the medical miracle, as extraordinary as that is. It is you." Margaret turned to look at him, surprised by the direction of his words. "Me? What do you mean?" The veterinarian smiled, a rare expression that transformed his serious face. "You never gave up," he explained. "When I told you the odds, when Calloway tried to take the foals, when everything seemed stacked against you, you just kept going, kept fighting, kept loving. That is the real miracle here, Margaret. Not 4 foals surviving against impossible odds, but one woman showing all of us what courage and faith really look like." The afternoon passed in a blur of speeches and music and shared meals. The school children performed their presentation about the foals, complete with hand-drawn posters and a song they had written themselves. Eleanor gave a brief account of the legal battle, carefully omitting the more contentious details, but emphasizing the importance of standing up for what is right. Local officials presented Margaret with a proclamation declaring this day an official celebration in the county calendar, to be observed annually in honor of the miracle birth. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold, the crowd gradually thinned. Families headed home with tired children and full bellies, calling out their goodbyes and promises to return next year. The volunteers began the work of cleaning up, refusing Margaret's offers of help and insisting that she had done enough simply by sharing this day with them. Margaret found herself alone at the pasture fence as twilight settled over the farm. Bella and the foals had returned to the barn for their evening feeding, leaving the field empty except for the fireflies that were beginning to emerge from the grass. She stood there for a long time, letting the peace of the moment wash over her, thinking about Samuel and the gift that had started everything. A gentle breeze stirred the air, carrying with it the scent of flowers and the distant sound of music from somewhere down the road. Margaret closed her eyes and let herself imagine that Samuel was standing beside her, his hand warm in hers, his voice soft in her ear. She could almost hear him saying the words he had spoken so many times during their life together. "I am proud of you, Margaret. I always knew you were capable of extraordinary things." When she opened her eyes, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. She wiped the tears from her cheeks and smiled up at them, knowing that somewhere beyond that vast expanse of space and time, Samuel was watching over her and Bella and the 4 miraculous foals who had brought so much joy into the world. "Thank you," she whispered to the stars, to the wind, to the memory of the man she would love forever. "Thank you for everything." And as night fell over the Thompson farm, Margaret walked slowly toward the barn to say goodnight to her family, her heart full of gratitude for the past, hope for the future, and a love that would never end.